So imagine this. You are designing this comprehensive, like 6-month behavior intervention plan.
Okay, setting the stage.
Right. And you pour hours into training the staff, you consult with the family, you completely redesign the classroom environment, and you finally, implement the procedure.
Which is a huge lift.
Exactly. It's a massive lift. And a month goes by, and the behavior hasn't changed. In fact, it's actually worse.
Oh, man.
You-
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario right there.
Right. And then you realize the terrifying truth. Your intervention wasn't actually flawed. Your baseline data was completely backward because a teacher's subjective memory of the behavior was just entirely different from what was actually happening in the room.
Yeah. You basically build a house on a swamp.
Yes, a house on a swamp.
And, I mean, that is a clinical nightmare, but unfortunately it happens far more often than we like to admit in this field.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. Because the integrity of any behavior analytic project, it really depends entirely on the stability of that initial data collection.
Yeah.
Like, if your starting point is compromised by a flawed measurement system, your clinical decisions are compromised.
You're effectively throwing darts in the dark.
Exactly. You're just guessing.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive for behavioral intelligence con Mara Sánchez is entirely focused on you, the BCBA candidate, the RBT, or, the seasoned behavior analyst prepping for your next big clinical hurdle.
We are tackling domain C.2 from the BACB Test Content Outline today.
Yes, we are. We're looking at the really critical distinctions between direct, indirect, and product measures of behavior. Because this isn't just about memorizing vocabulary for a multiple choice exam, right?
No, not at all. It is about understanding the very bedrock of how we capture human behavior and, actually translate it into actionable, accurate data.
Because before we can trust any data set on a line graph, we have to interrogate where it came from, right? Like, how was it gathered?
Yeah, what filter did it pass through? And I think in almost every new clinical case, the very first filter we encounter is also kind of the most dangerous one, if you aren't careful.
Oh, for sure, because we almost always begin with indirect measurement.
Right, the subjective starting line.
Yeah, and I mean, indirect assessment is exactly what it sounds like. It's gathering information about a behavior without physically being in the room to observe it happen in real time.
You're relying entirely on secondhand information.
Completely. This includes your initial caregiver interviews or having a teacher fill out a checklist or using those standardized rating scales.
Yeah, the sources heavily referenced tools we all know, right? Like the FAST, the functional assessment screening tool.
Yep, the FAST-T, the motivation assessment scale, the child behavior checklist, all of those.
And the defining mechanism of like every single one of those tools is that they rely on human recall.
Which is inherently flawed.
Highly flawed. You are asking a parent or a paraprofessional to synthesize past events. You're asking them, like, how often does the child engage in property destruction?
Or what typically happens immediately following the elopement.
Right. You are asking a human brain to act as a perfectly calibrated data collection device, which, it absolutely is not.
It's not. And this is the trap, right? Like, I see new practitioners fall into this constantly.
All the time.
They get a completed, say, motivation assessment scale back from a school district. They tally up the Likert scale scores, and they say, fantastic, the highest score is in the escape column. The function is escape. Let's draft the intervention.
It's so tempting to just take it at face value.
It is. But the sources explicitly warn us that indirect measures are never enough to conclusively determine a behavior's function.
The literature is incredibly clear on this, and it's because indirect measures suffer from notoriously low inter-rater reliability.
Right. Because if you give that...
Well, like, if you give that exact same FAST or Many-S to two different teachers who work with the exact same student in the exact same classroom, the data will frequently show two completely different behavioral functions.
Okay, let's unpack the why behind that low inter-rater agreement. Because it's not because the teachers are careless, right?
No, not at all. They're trying their best.
It's because subjective memory is just heavily influenced by recency bias and emotional stress. Like, if a student threw a chair yesterday, that highly stressful, severe instance is going to dominate the teacher's memory when they fill out the survey today.
Even if the student's typical day-to-day behavior is actually, minor non-compliance for attention.
Exactly. That emotional weighting totally skews the data. You are getting a highly filtered, highly interpreted version of reality.
It's essentially like, well, you know what it's like. It's like trying to write a professional review of a restaurant based entirely on what your cousin remembers eating there last week.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. Because your cousin's memory of the meal is influenced by, like, whether they were in a good mood that day or whether they even like spicy food?
Or if the waiter was rude. It's helpful context, sure, but it is not the food.
No, it's not the food. You cannot write a credible review without tasting the meal yourself.
That highlights the exact mechanism of the flaw right there.
Yeah.
Indirect measures give you a narrative, they don't give you an objective metric.
Okay, but this raises a huge question. If the inter-rater reliability is historically poor and human memory is deeply flawed by recency bias, why do we even use them?
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. Like, if I know the restaurant review is entirely secondhand and biased, why read it? Why don't behavior analysts just skip the indirect surveys and go straight to direct observation?
Because you need a scouting report.
A scouting report. Okay, explain that.
It seems backwards to use a tool you know is flawed, but indirect measures are actually highly efficient at forming your initial hypotheses. They don't give you the definitive function, but they narrow the field. They tell you when and where you need to point your camera, so to speak.
Oh, I see. So if I have a client who only engages in severe headbanging, like twice a week, I can't realistically sit in their living room for 40 hours a week just hoping I happen to be there when it occurs.
Precisely the point. You'd burn through all your clinical hours in a week.
Yeah, that's completely impractical.
But if the caregiver interview reveals that the headbanging almost exclusively occurs during transition to bath time, or when an iPad is removed, you now have a targeted window.
You know exactly when to schedule your physical presence.
Exactly. The indirect assessment is the map that guides you to the actual destination, which is direct measurement.
Which brings us to the gold standard. Direct measurement. This is where we strip away the subjective filter entirely.
Right. We are actually observing and recording the behavior exactly as it occurs in real time in the natural environment.
No more asking what happened yesterday. We are documenting objective reality right now.
This is where we capture actual performance. So, if the target is the number of verbal commands a child emits during a play session, you physically sit in the room and tally every single vocalization.
Or if you're conducting a functional behavior assessment, you are using ABC narrative recording.
Yep. Documenting the antecedent, the actual topography of the behavior, and the consequence exactly as they unfold.
Without the distortion of human memory.
Exactly.
And for you listening, this translates into a really vital exam strategy. The BACB exam loves to test your adherence to objective data.
Oh, they absolutely do.
So when a scenario asks you for the most accurate way to identify a preferred stimulus or establish a baseline, always look for the direct observation answer over the indirect one.
Right, like if the question asks, how should you determine which vocational task an adult client prefers?
And your options are, asking their job coach, giving the client a verbal survey, or conducting a free operant observation where you actually watch what they engage with.
Always pick the direct observation.
Oh.
Because stated preferences on a questionnaire frequently do not translate into actual reinforcers in practice.
Totally. What people say they will do and what they actually do when the contingencies are in place are often two very different things.
Direct measurement proves the functional relationship.
But we have to address the massive logistical elephant in the room here.
Yes, the practicality problem.
Right, because direct measurement is perfect in a textbook vacuum. But clinical practice happens in the messy, chaotic, real world.
It does. And direct, continuous measurement requires a practitioner to be physically present, actively observing, and recording every single instance of a behavior for the entire observation period.
Which is incredibly resource intensive. Like, if you are tracking a high-frequency behavior, say vocal stereotypy, you cannot take your eyes off the client for a second.
You can't consult with a teacher. You can't write a separate report.
For a single human being managing a full caseload, continuous direct measurement is often physically impossible.
And that is exactly where the field has to make a compromise. Because we can't always continuously measure everything, we rely on discontinuous sampling methods.
Right, where we divide the observation period into smaller intervals and just record whether the behavior occurred during those specific blocks of time.
Yeah, so we're talking about whole interval recording, partial interval recording, and momentary time sampling.
But that logistical compromise comes with a pretty steep mathematical cost, doesn't it?
It really does. What's fascinating here is that when you use discontinuous measurement, you are no longer capturing a perfect reflection of reality. You are generating what the literature calls Measurement artifacts.
Artifacts. Let's really drill down into the mechanism of these artifacts, because this is where exam questions get incredibly tricky for people.
Yes, they do.
An artifact is data that looks completely real and solid on your line graph, but it is actually a distortion created by the measurement system itself.
Let's look at the math behind partial interval recording, just as an example.
Okay, lay it out.
Let's say you are observing a student for 10 minutes, and that's broken down into 10 one-minute intervals. The target behavior is out-of-seat behavior.
Okay, 10 one-minute intervals. Got it.
Over that 10-minute period, the student only stands up for 2 seconds during every single 1-minute interval.
Wait, so in reality, out of 600 total seconds, the student was out of their seat for a grand total of 20 seconds.
Exactly.
That is a tiny fraction of the time.
But look at how partial interval recording captures that. Because the behavior occurred for just a split second at some point within every single interval, the observer marks a yes for all 10 intervals.
Oh, wow. So the resulting data says the behavior occurred during 100% of the intervals.
100%.
That's crazy. The graph shows a massive, severe problem, 100% occurrence, when the continuous reality was just 20 seconds of behavior. The system completely artificially inflated the data.
And that overestimation is the artifact.
Right, and then the inverse happens with the whole interval recording, right?
Exactly. If a behavior needs to be increased, like cooperative play, and you use whole interval recording, the child has to play continuously for the entire 1-minute interval to earn a yes.
So if they play cooperatively for 58 seconds but look away for 2 seconds...
that interval is marked as a 0.
Wow. So the child could play cooperatively for 95% of the total session, but if those brief pauses happen across multiple intervals, your data sheet might say they only engaged in the behavior like 10% of the time.
Yeah. The whole interval system mathematically crushes the data, creating an artifact of underestimation.
Understanding the why behind these artifacts is so crucial, because if you don't realize your measurement system is distorting the reality, you might implement a highly restrictive intervention for a behavior that isn't actually that severe.
Just because partial interval recording inflated it on your graph.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. Indirect measurement is a highly subjective scouting report. Direct measurement is objective reality, but continuous direct measurement will drain all your resources, and discontinuous direct measurement creates mathematical artifacts.
It's a tough spot to be in.
So what is the alternative? Like, how do we get objective, accurate data when the practitioner absolutely cannot be in the room?
We look at what the behavior leaves behind. We turn to product measurement, also known as permanent product.
The environmental footprint.
Exactly. Product measurement is defined as measuring a behavior after it has occurred by observing the physical ex post facto changes it produced in the environment.
So you are no longer measuring the behavior itself as it happens.
No, you are measuring the direct result of the behavior.
The sources provide some really clean examples of this, like a teacher grading a stack of math worksheets.
A classic example.
The teacher doesn't need to stand over the student's desk for 45 minutes, directly observing the pencil moving across the paper. They can go teach another group of students, come back an hour later, and just collect the worksheet.
Because the written answers are the permanent product of the student's academic behavior.
Right. Or, consider an adult client working in a vocational assembly task. The job coach doesn't need to watch them assemble every single widget in real time.
At the end of the 2-hour shift, the coach simply counts the number of fully assembled widgets in the completed bin.
Because the number of widgets is the permanent product of the assembly behavior.
It's forensic science, really.
Huh. Forensic ABA.
Basically, think of a detective. A detective walks into a room, smells gunpowder, and finds exactly 6 bullet holes in the wall. The detective didn't directly observe the gun being fired. They weren't there, but they can objectively conclude, based entirely on the environmental change, that 6 shots were fired.
The clinical utility here is immense. It drastically increases a behavior analyst's efficiency.
Oh, massively. You can track data across multiple clients in different locations simultaneously because you can review the products at your own convenience.
And it completely changes the game for inter-observer agreement, or IOA, doesn't it?
It really does. Because the product is static.
Right.
If 2 observers are trying to calculate IOA for a high-rate, rapid behavior happening live in the room, they might blink, they might look away, their timing might be off.
Yeah, human error.
But with a permanent product like a worksheet or an assembled widget, the environmental change doesn't move. Both observers can look at the exact same physical evidence, take their time counting it, and calculate nearly flawless agreement.
Which is amazing. And that brings us to the concept of artificial permanent products, specifically video and audio recordings.
Yeah, this is a big one. A video recording is categorized as an artificial permanent product because the behavior itself doesn't naturally leave a video behind, right?
Yeah.
We introduce the camera to create a permanent record of the behavior.
And this is an incredibly powerful tool for complex topographies.
Absolutely.
You can pause a video, you can rewind it. If you have a client with a highly complex, rapid motor stereotypy, taking live data on the exact duration and frequency is almost impossible.
You just can't catch it all.
But with video, you can literally freeze reality. You can watch it in slow motion to ensure your data is perfectly accurate.
Exactly.
But I need to do something here because this feels like a trap waiting to happen on an exam.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a permanent product is just an observable change in the environment, it feels like you could justify almost anything as a permanent product.
Right, if you stretch it enough.
Yeah. Like, if I walk into a teenager's room and there are clothes scattered all over the floor, can I just point to the messy floor as a permanent product to measure their non-compliance with doing laundry?
You cannot, and that exact assumption is where exam questions will try to trap you.
I knew it!
Yeah, we can't just look at an ambiguous environmental change and assume we know the exact behavioral topography that caused it. For permanent product measurement to be scientifically valid, it must pass a highly rigid two-part test of correspondence.
Okay, let's test my logic on this. Rule 1 has to be about consistency. Like, if I want to measure the teenager throwing clothes on the floor, the behavior has to leave that exact same mark every single time it happens.
Correct.
If they throw clothes on the floor, the messy floor has to exist.
That is rule 1. Every occurrence of the target behavior must produce the same permanent product. It has to be a 1-to-1 ratio.
Okay, and rule 2 has to be about exclusivity. Looking at the messy room, it could mean the teenager threw a tantrum and tossed their clothes, but it could also mean the family dog got into the laundry basket and dragged everything out.
Precisely.
Because I can't prove 100% that the target behavior caused the mess, the product is clinically useless.
You've nailed rule 2. The permanent product can only be produced by the target behavior. There cannot be any plausible alternative explanation for how that environmental change occurred. If the dog could have done it, it completely fails the test.
Let's apply this strict two-rule filter to a real clinical case study from the source material. It's a heavy example, but it perfectly illustrates how easily practitioners get this wrong.
It's a very common pitfall.
Imagine a practitioner wants to measure a client's severe skin-picking behavior. Instead of sitting there and taking continuous rate data, they decide to just count the number of new bruises or scabs on the client's arms at the end of every week.
Okay.
At first glance, counting scabs feels like a great use of permanent product. The picking happened in the past, and it left a clear physical mark on the environment, the client's skin.
It feels intuitive, definitely. But let's run it through the filter. Does it pass rule 1? Does every single instance of skin picking produce a visible bruise or scab?
Definitely not. A client might engage in the skin-picking topography 20 times in an hour, but do it lightly enough that it doesn't break the skin or leave any visible mark.
Right.
So the target behavior occurred, but the permanent product was not produced. The 1-to-1 ratio is broken. It fails rule 1.
And what about rule 2, exclusivity? Is the target behavior of skin picking the absolute only possible way a bruise or scab could appear on that client's arm?
No way. A bruise could be caused by the client tripping and falling on the playground. It could be caused by bumping their arm against a desk. It could be caused by a peer grabbing their arm.
Yep.
Because there are multiple alternative explanations for how that environmental change occurred, it completely fails rule 2.
And this is the critical takeaway here. Therefore, measuring skin picking by counting scabs is a completely invalid use of permanent product.
Wow. Yeah, that makes so much sense.
If you build your intervention on that data, you are building it on an illusion. The false positives from the bumps and bruises, combined with the false negatives from the light picking, will render your data entirely inaccurate. In this specific case, the behavior absolutely must be measured directly in real time.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now as you evaluate scenario questions?
That's the real application.
When the exam presents a scenario and asks if permanent product is the most appropriate measurement system, you must aggressively run it through that two rules filter. Ask yourself, does the behavior always leave this exact mark? And is it impossible for anything else to have caused this mark?
If there is even a slight possibility of an alternative explanation, permanent product is the wrong answer.
It is the line that separates a subjective guess from an objective scientific measurement.
Truly.
Let's tie all of this together. We started with indirect measurement. It is your subjective, secondhand scouting report.
Right. It suffers from poor inter-rater agreement due to recency bias and emotional filtering, but it is a necessary tool for forming your initial hypothesis about when and where a behavior occurs.
Which then guides you to direct measurement. This is your objective gold standard, capturing reality as it unfolds.
It proves the functional relationship, but it requires heavy resources. And when we are forced to use discontinuous sampling methods like partial or whole interval recording, we have to be acutely aware of those mathematical artifacts.
The overestimations and underestimations that those systems inherently create.
Exactly.
And finally, we explored product measurement, or permanent product, the environmental footprint. It's highly efficient, it allows for incredibly high IOA because the product is static, and it permits the use of video analysis.
But it can only be utilized if it strictly passes the two rules of one-to-one consistency and absolute exclusivity.
All three systems have distinct advantages and vulnerabilities. Knowing how to weigh those trade-offs in different clinical environments is what ensures your behavior interventions are built on concrete rather than sand.
Beautifully said.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive into Domain C.2. As always, this series for Behavioral Intelligence Con Mara Sánchez is designed to support RBTs, BCBA candidates, and practicing behavior analysts who are serious about mastering the science and applying it effectively in the field.
And if you're looking for more resources, study guides, or support, you can head over to www.amethysttherapyservices.com.
Or shoot an email directly to info@amethysttherapyservices.com. Make sure you stick around for our next session, where we will be moving right down the outline to Domain C.3, getting deep into the mechanics of measuring the occurrence of behavior.
But before we wrap up completely, I do want to leave you with a final thought regarding those artificial permanent products we discussed earlier.
Oh, the video and audio recordings.
Yes. So we established that video is a fantastic measurement tool because it allows us to analyze complex behaviors after the fact, achieving near-perfect IOA.
Right.
But if we pull back and look at the behavioral environment as a whole, consider the mechanism of observation itself.
Okay.
Does the physical introduction of a camera into a client's living room or classroom inherently act as an indirect influence on their behavior?
Oh, wow.
Does the mere presence of that recording device trigger a reactive effect that fundamentally alters, suppresses, or exaggerates the very objective reality the camera was brought in to capture?
That is a fascinating question.
It's a question of whether true, uninfluenced measurement is ever actually possible when the subject knows they are being watched. Something for you to think about.